Hello everybody, my name is Nicola Carr. I'm based in the University of Nottingham and I was previously in Queen's University in Belfast. Thanks to Sean for a fascinating presentation, a hard act to follow. I met Sean, I met him a good while back, but I heard him speak we had a criminology autumn school back in October last year where we talked about our various aspects of research. I'm going to be presenting today on research conducted in Northern Ireland on young people's experiences of paramilitary punishment and paramilitary violence. And I think that there are parallels to what Sean has talked about in terms of, the influence of networks within areas, the hidden nature of young people's victimisation as well, which is obviously the theme of one of the themes that we're covering today. So, as I said, I'm going to be talking about a particular project that I've been involved in with my colleagues Claire Dwyer and Siobhan McAllister in Queen's University Belfast. It was funded by the British Academy. And part of the impetus for us seeking to do research in this area in the first place was in light of the 20th anniversary of the ceasefires, the official ceasefires in Northern Ireland, which was around kind of 2014, 2015, which is when we got funding. And although there was this kind of, dominant narrative of the positive transition into kind of post-conflict society, which if you look at all the kind of data in terms of, major violence, etc., that is absolutely the case. But rumbling underneath this, there's this unsettled peace. And some of it has kind of erupted, I think, in relation to what we're seeing currently, in the fact that there isn't currently an agreed government in Northern Ireland, but also in the continued activity of paramilitary violence within communities. And at the time that we applied to do this research, at least this issue wasn't being talked about at the forefront of people's discussions. There's elements of why that might have been the case, not wanting to unsettle the peace, etc. But we were coming across it in other research that we were doing in relation to young people's experience within the criminal justice system, where we were talking to young people who were involved in the criminal justice system, who had been adjudicated through the courts, who'd gone through restorative justice interventions, who were in custody, who themselves were telling us that alongside all these interventions, the formal justice system, they were experiencing this informal justice meted out upon them in relation to punishment within their communities. So all of these factors influenced us to look at this area. The criminal justice system in and of itself has been intimately linked to the process of conflict transformation in Northern Ireland. As part of the Good Friday Agreement, there was a review of the criminal justice system, which entailed looking at all the kind of different agencies within the criminal justice system. Separate to that, there was the Patten review of policing and the Patten report of policing, which led to the disestablishment of the Royal Ulster Constabulary and the establishment of the Police Service for Northern Ireland. The Criminal Justice Review looked at all aspects of the criminal justice system, and in particular in relation to youth justice, it recommended the establishment of a new agency, the Youth Justice Agency, and that was established following legislation in 2002. But alongside that, in this legislation, it also set in place that restorative justice would be the main response for young people involved in the criminal justice system. So basically in Northern Ireland, as distinct from the Republic, if a young person is charged with an offence, pleads guilty or is found guilty, in court or the Public Prosecution Service are legally obliged to direct that young person towards a restorative justice conference. There are only a small number of exceptions where that is the case, if it's a very, very serious offence or if the young person is denying responsibility. But basically, the main measure for dealing with young people in the youth justice system in Northern Ireland is restorative justice youth conferencing. And this kind of notion of restorative justice being placed at the heart of the criminal justice system for young people was very much, for people who've written about this area, have talked about it being very much linked to kind of legitimacy of the criminal justice system. So bringing the buy-in of the community into the process of the administration of criminal justice. The idea of restorative justice, I'm sure many of you are aware, is that it's about restoring the harm caused by offending, bringing together community, the victim and the offender into a process where the harm is restored. Now there's lots of debates about whether that's attainable, but nonetheless that's very much linked to the heart of the youth justice system. So this notion of legitimacy built into the youth justice system, this notion of restoration, this notion of holding young people to account is very much at the heart of the process. As I said, when we went, and this is prior to doing our paramilitary study, which I'll go on to talk about in a moment, when we went in to look at young people's experiences of the formal justice system in a study that we did with young people in the Juvenile Justice Centre, which is the equivalent of children detention schools here, we were interviewing young people about their experiences of the criminal justice system. So these were young people in custody, and we did life history interviews with them, basically talking about their kind of trajectory of how they ended up in custody, what their plans were for when they were being released. We followed them up into the community to talk about, what happened to them, and a few of them obviously came back and forth into the custodial system. But what emerged from this research in the criminal justice system, and again, we hadn't gone in to look at paramilitarism in any way, was that a significant proportion of the young people, more than half, in the criminal justice system in this particular research, alongside the criminal justice formal interventions, so the restorative justice, the detention, whatever they may have been, they also experienced significant experiences of intimidation, threats, beatings, exiling. So these are just two examples or two quotes here from young people involved in that study. So the first of these, Anthony, talks about, being beaten up basically for involvement in antisocial behaviour in these areas. He described it, or as he said, being a wee dick, which is a particular Northern Ireland expression. Or Patrick, in the second example there, talks about being basically told to get out of his area because of his involvement in offending. So we're interested in the concept of punishment within the formal justice system, and a lot of criminology research does obviously focus upon that. And a lot of criminology research focuses on formal processing within criminal justice systems. Penal governance, how our criminal justice systems are operated, our penal institutions, prisons, community sanctions, youth justice, policing, etc., etc. But underneath that, there's all other forms of punishment that take place, and increasingly scholars are looking at this area. For example, in looking at how punishment takes place in kind of welfare sanctioning, particularly in the UK, so these quasi-penal measures. So alongside the formal punishment system, we have quasi-penal measures. But also underneath that, we also have punishment taking place in diverse settings. Hannah Moffat and Mona Lynch talk about we need to really focus on what constitutes punishment in diverse settings, and really are our kind of broader criminological theories sufficient to explain on the ground punitive practices. And really that's part of what we were looking at in terms of thinking about paramilitary punishments in particular. There's a range of non-penal but punitive measures. We'd be familiar with Ian O'Donnell and Ona Sullivan's work in the Irish context, talking about coercive confinement, for example. We've had lots of different ways in which we enact punishment or penality that isn't through the formal justice system. And also what we were interested in was this notion about between notions of exclusion and punishment. So punishment in relation to the young people that we spoke to, focusing on the most marginal and excluded. Potentially, one of the famous quotes used about kind of youth justice, for example, is that by Barry Golson, famously, that it processes the children of the poor. We can all have different kind of takes on that. But also the kind of sanctions within the criminal justice system acting as exclusionary measures upon young people, and then underneath that, further punishment within their communities in relation to paramilitary punishment that we'll talk about. At the time we started this research back in 2015, as I said, this was bubbling under the surface. It's gotten more and more attention over time, particularly in the last couple of years. Kind of frequent headlines from some of the local papers in Northern Ireland. People being brought to be punished. Sean talked there about somebody being taking their beating, which is a kind of similar kind of resonance in Northern Ireland, and increased kind of visibility of this within the Northern Ireland context. So what do we mean by paramilitary activity? There are official definitions that are used by the Police Service of Northern Ireland. These are just some of the kind of categories that we would talk about. They talk about kind of broader categories of terrorist-related activity, which includes shootings, bombings, etc. So-called alternative policing within communities, and a range of punishments such as beatings and shootings for so-called offences of antisocial behaviour, areas like joyriding, criminality, drug dealing, and for informing or feuding. So there's an understanding that this takes place, and that is reflected in the PSNI produced these security situation statistics that document what's recorded or reported to them in relation to these kind of activities. So in these security situation statistics, which are published on a quarterly basis in Northern Ireland, we have information on any killing that's attributed to paramilitarism or terrorist-related incidents, any bombing incidents. But what we also have is data, official data from the police on casualties as a result of paramilitary shootings, or style shootings as they call them, or casualties as a result of paramilitary style assaults. And you see that in 2015-16, the number of paramilitary style assaults officially reported to the police were 47 attributed to loyalists, and 11 attributed to Republican paramilitaries. Now, we all know the issues with crime data. In particular, this type of data only reflects that which comes to the attention of the police. And there's lots of reasons, which I'll go on to talk about in a moment, why there's lots of kind of lower level activity, or not necessarily lower level activity, but activity happening that doesn't come to the attention of the police. But nonetheless, what this data shows us, and the fact that it's still being produced by the police in Northern Ireland, is that this is ongoing, residual violence happening within communities in Northern Ireland post-ceasefire, post all these kind of official rhetoric about post-conflict. And within the police data, they helpfully provide definitions of what they mean by paramilitary style shootings or paramilitary style assaults. So shootings, they talk about the injured party is usually shot on the knees, elbows, feet, ankles or thighs, and the motive is supposedly to punish the person for antisocial activities. These paramilitary style shootings are generally conducted by loyalists or Republican paramilitary groups on members of their own community. And as assaults, it talks about the definition of assaults, and again this notion that they're committed in inter-community by people against their own community. Just an illustration of the type of paramilitary groupings that we're talking about in Northern Ireland currently. These are some of the ones in the different groupings. So the background to looking at this particular study on young people's experiences of paramilitary punishment was our sense that young people's voices within this weren't necessarily being surfaced. Certainly when we interviewed young people in our previous study within the criminal justice system, we uncovered and unearthed a high degree of paramilitary punishments and assaults upon young people. They would describe it as a result of their own behaviour, kind of provoked this attention within the community, this negative attention. But interestingly, of all the young people that we spoke to when we conducted research in the criminal justice system, none of these young people had reported these assaults or exclusions from their area to official authorities. So these kind of level of activity that was happening in the community wouldn't appear in those statistics that I showed you previously. Really, the type of incidents that appear in the police statistics were when a young person would turn up in A&E and it would be reported in that kind of place. But if any other kind of issues, it wouldn't appear in those statistics. So our study, funded by the British Academy, was looking at the way in which young people's lives were kind of informally regulated, especially those young people who came to the attention, negative attention in communities because they were deemed to be antisocial. We were interested in the kind of double justice experienced by young people who may have experienced formal criminal justice sanctioning and then other sanctioning within their community in this informal system. And we were interested in the protections and supports available to young people in these situations. So the study had basically three phases. We chose three areas to research within Northern Ireland, and we determined our choice of area both by the PSNI data that I showed you there, which kind of gave an indication of the kind of levels of activity in different areas of Northern Ireland. So that was the public data available. We also had a project reference group that helped us kind of identify particular areas, and there was also kind of newspaper reports of ongoing, in local newspapers, of ongoing kind of activities within communities. We also wanted to ensure kind of diversity across different communities in terms of our choice of areas. In other words, diversity in terms of loyalist Republican communities, rural, urban. So we selected 3 sites, 2 in main urban areas and 1 in a satellite area. And we conducted community assessment interviews with key stakeholders in the community. So we're talking about police, youth justice agency providers, restorative justice projects, local politicians in some instances, to kind of get a temperature or gauge of what was happening in the area. We then interviewed or sought to interview young people who had some sort of contact or involvement or would have been aware of kind of paramilitary activity in their communities. And we did this, and I'll be talking in more detail in the afternoon session about the particular methodology, by identifying young people who were already connected in with services. And you can appreciate from an ethical point of view that that was important in terms of ensuring that young people had this kind of, protections around them if particular instances were disclosed, if they became distressed in interviews. And obviously there was a big confidential element in terms of participant safety. So for example, we didn't snowball sample, which would be, asking young people, do they know of other young people who may be interested in participate, because we needed to kind of secure the safety of participants. So we interviewed 37 young people aged between 16 and 25 as part of our method. So I just want to talk a little bit about some of the kind of main thematic kind of findings from the study. And I think it touches somewhat on what Sean has said earlier, and also raises questions about, legitimacy of criminal justice institutions, perceived legitimacy of other types of institutions in relation to young people's feelings of where they can go for help, feelings about who controls communities, feelings about where sovereignty lies, as you mentioned there. I suppose the first thing to say, and this is a group of 37 young people engaged in lots of different services, lots of different areas, was the kind of extent to which they had been experienced paramilitary violence, both visibly in terms of actually experiencing family members being shot dead, as a 16-year-old described, experiencing friends who got into trouble around a drug debt, who subsequently died by suicide, as one young person described, and young people talking about, they exist in communities, but if something happens to people in terms of punishment, they deserve it. This is the way things work in these communities. This kind of sense in which this is normal life, basically. The extent to which young people talked about within our sample, kind of really quite extreme violence that they'd witnessed, and the extent to which this violence essentially was normalised was something that was quite striking. And when we kind of tried to talk through with people, the interviews were very much focused on young people's sense, as I set out the research questions there, their sense of why, what the experience was like within their communities, whether they experienced it directly, indirectly, etc., but also in terms of what they felt was the kind of sustaining elements, or what were their attitudes towards paramilitaries within their communities. And they talked about, some of the functions, the positive functions as they saw it, of paramilitaries serving their communities. They talked about, basically that in some instances paramilitaries acted these kind of quasi-policing functions. So this same young person who'd experienced one of his friends dying by suicide as a result of being intimidated over a drug debt, talked about, paramilitaries help people in terms of, they will sort out if somebody's house is broken into. The second young person there, Natalie, talking about, it's different with the police. If you ring the police, they'd be like, oh, we don't know who it was. But because we're in a tight-knit community, they're more likely to be able to find out who it was, when it happened, and can give them a slap on the wrist or whatever they need done for it. So there's a kind of higher power or fear of them. So try and just get everybody in the straight and narrow, I suppose. And within these kind of narratives, this sense, and it came through in lots of different responses, I'm just putting some examples here, this sense in which on the one hand, paramilitaries were involved in quite extensive violence against young people in terms of regulation, but on the other hand, young people talked about, there's a legitimacy within the community towards paramilitary activity, because basically they offer swifter, more effective justice than the regular policing. Young people talked about another example of police having to look for evidence or go through due process, where actually you don't need to bother with that. If you talk to the paramilitaries, they'll just sort it quickly. And so there's all sorts of issues and problems there in relation to this kind of response. We also spoke to young people who talked as well about this notion that paramilitaries would be responsible for protecting their communities. And this, in some instances, is about protecting them from the other side. So obviously communities, paramilitaries protect us from Catholics coming into Protestant communities and wrecking them. Obviously the paramilitaries are there for a reason. Yes, there's a bad thing to do it, but without the paramilitaries, then your community would be fucked. So this sense in which, paramilitaries protected or provided this wider protection to the community in the context of concerns about broader state legitimacies. In the second example here, this notion of protection, Derek talks about paramilitaries are more like street people that protect the street. Fair enough, most people say with selling drugs and all that there. Yes, fair enough, they do that. But they're protecting the community. Say if rapists come into the community or if paedophiles come into the community, the police will have to do certain research to put them out, which the paramilitaries can just go down, put a death threat. So paramilitaries are good. Yes, there's bad things, but there's also good things that can happen. So again, this sense in which, swifter justice, even if it was arbitrary, even if it wasn't due process on all these kind of elements, but that it would be seen by some communities as more effective than formal justice institutions. But touching upon that, there's a huge ambivalence in young people's accounts of this kind of paramilitary roles. And what they talked about also was this kind of notion of kind of hypocrisy in relation to the sense in which, on one hand, their communities could be protected, and you could see then how this could be sustained within communities. But on the other hand, that in some contexts, paramilitaries, and obviously this differed from community to community, but in some, young people would describe them as basically business gangsters. They're basically controlling trade on the turf in relation to drugs, and that's basically what they're about. And, any kind of sense of protection, it comes at this sort of price. So alongside all of these kind of different accounts of young people is this sense of this ambivalence, this tension between so-called protection and this notion of, they're doing good for the community, but as Linda there says in the last example, they shouldn't have the right to act as if they are the police, but nonetheless, this is what occurs within communities. One of the aims of our study as well was to look at young people and whether there was kind of evidence, and this is something that's gained prominence recently as well, about joining paramilitaries. None of the young people in our sample had become involved themselves, and again that's probably a feature of sampling, and whether we would have access to young people who had actually become joined into paramilitaries would be much more a different type of studies. But when young people were aware of young people kind of becoming involved in paramilitary organisations, and they talked about the sense of becoming involved, young people doing dirty jobs, which perhaps might link to some of what Sean was talking about earlier in terms of networks, because they feel power. You want to feel a bit more power, so you join. It's a way of protection, and it's a way of feeling better protected. So, you can see some of the kind of pulls for young people in this process also. But I've alluded to there, and it comes across in lots of the narratives, is this sense in which the legitimacy of formal institutions was something that was kind of an ongoing question throughout. And you can see why that might be the case in Northern Ireland. But it sounds, from what Sean was presenting, and certainly I don't know if Johnny will come on to talk about this, that there is a question about legitimacy of formal institutions in contexts where young people are experiencing these kind of arbitrary violence and they don't see justice happening for them. As I said, young people themselves, when we did our criminal justice study, had themselves been held to account through the criminal justice system. Now, we can debate what we think about that, but they felt a kind of inherent hypocrisy that their sense of victimisation wasn't being recognised, particularly in restorative justice processes, which is very much about a particular instance where you're restoring the harm in relation to one particular offence. Their sense was, well, what about all the stuff that's happened to me previously? That doesn't kind of come on the table, and nor would I feel safe about bringing it onto the table, indeed. Young people in this study and in the previous study would, under no circumstances, go to the police in relation to what they'd experienced. And part of what they said, was, I don't go to the police because the police wouldn't do anything, or they do nothing, and paramilitaries get away with everything. There's this sense in which, as I was saying there, that paramilitaries are seen as more effective in terms of swifter justice, and people think that conversely paramilitaries make the communities safer. So all of this is kind of contributing to this notion of this kind of cycle of exclusion, in particular in the particular communities that we studied. In some instances, young people talked about kind of resisting, you know, and there's a colloquial term used for young people, they sometimes call themselves, you know, I'm a hood, I'm not involved in paramilitarism, I'm involved in antisocial behaviour or criminality. And having the identity of a hood is, you know, about kind of, you know, being resistant to some of this type of thing. But some people who kind of, young people who talked about, you know, I'm a hood, I get involved in antisocial behaviour, etc., but I'm not part of that, would experience more punishment within their communities as a result. And this resistance, as we kind of analysed in relation to the young people we talked to, led to and is justification for them for further kind of exclusion and punishment in their community. So this way of kind of standing up to it, even in negative senses, has continued kind of negative effects. And we talked about, I mean, this is a poster that was visible in the communities. You know, one of the young people in the study talked about, I'd rather get shot than be a tout. That's the kind of, you know, sense in which the idea of going and reporting some of these instances and not being able to access those forms of justice. So there's a kind of, you know, issue around access to justice for young people, speed of justice and community for the community, and the legitimacy deficit. And this kind of cycle kind of maintains this violence within particular communities and reproduces violence as we establish it. So, as I said, none of the young people in our particular sample talked about being part of paramilitary groupings. But what they did talk about was the kind of cultural factors, such as family and community, but also structural and political factors, such as lack of opportunities, political and social marginality, sometimes the search for kind of, you know, a particular identity, proving manhood, etc. And these kind of impetuses or kind of drivers of social exclusion were part of kind of the replication of these cycles. Now, recently there has been discussions about kind of higher profile visibility about tackling paramilitarism within Northern Ireland. And, you know, some of that is framed in the context of kind of like, these are gangs, these are not kind of legitimate in any other way. But I think from our research and from wider research, we would certainly make the argument that it's really important to ground analysis or interventions within historical understandings. You know, it isn't about you know, plopping something in or dropping something in like a program that's going to magically address this issue. It's about recognising you know, issues around marginality more broadly and that social historical context. And nowhere is that kind of more true than in Northern Ireland. But at the other hand, on the other side of it, we have this Stormont Agreement, which is about a fresh start. That does talk about starting to address paramilitarism, but also talks about legacies of the past and the need to address those. And you probably heard those in discussions about reforming a government within Northern Ireland. As it stands, there is no government, and one of the things that young people talked about was kind of their access to any sort of voice. And it seems kind of, you know, even more amplified, that kind of silence when there isn't even a kind of like political a policy to even take forward some of these issues at the moment. So just to kind of conclude what I'm talking about here, I mean, our focus on paramilitary punishment in particular is this notion about needing to expand the penalty lens. Our research shows evidence of persistent paramilitary activity in communities. There is a clear issue about hidden victimisation, assaults, intimidations, criminality not reported to police or other authorities. And as I said, it's not just about policing in relation to this. For under 18s in particular, the child protection system should apply, or does apply. And these are child protection concerns when you're talking about young people being subject to physical abuse, essentially, or emotional abuse in different contexts. Young people have concerns regarding repercussions of reporting to the police. There are issues around confidence in policing, and this wider question links to wider questions of legitimacy, which leads to underreporting and then leads to this compounding effect of invisibility. But also, and I think this is important because it does come through in young people's narrative, there was support for paramilitaries within communities, but that's underscored with a sense of ambivalence. This sense of, they deal with particular issues is very ambivalent in relation to then describing kind of assaults upon young people themselves. I think what all of this does as well, and it's something that I'd just be keen to highlight in the context of our discussions here, and particularly when we talk about restorative justice in relation to some of these things, is that there is a need to kind of reconsider our kind of binary offender-victim dichotomizations, particularly in restorative justice terms, I would argue. But also, what we've uncovered is these are the kind of issues facing young people that may be labelled otherwise as offenders. The extent of their victimisation is something that really needs to be highlighted, and no doubt has impacts on their behaviour, as evidence here in just in relation to what some young people have said. And finally, certainly what we're arguing in terms of feeding back to our stakeholders in Northern Ireland is that there's a clear need to address the impact of activities of paramilitaries from a children's rights perspective and from a broader rights perspective. So thank you very much.